We've been looking at the last 2 weeks, and now we'll talk again this week about heroes and villains in the Bible. So a couple of weeks ago, I talked about Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and then should remember it, seeing how I did it. Oh, thank you. Yes, King Nebuchadnezzar with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We looked at that. Last week, Pastor Nate led you through Jesus and the Pharisees, which I think there was enough material to take up the whole time with that one, probably, as it turns out. And then this week, we have a couple possibilities of things that I put together. And I don't have sheets for you because there's just so much here. Two that I think are great stories. We can see if we get through both of them, but we'll vote on which one we want to do first. So one of the couplets is looking at Saul and David, when David sort of takes on the hero role and Saul takes on the villain role. And the other is Stephen and the angry mob that we see in the book of Acts. And Stephen's known as the first Christian martyr. So it's a very long part of it. Both of them are fairly long stories, how they play out, but there's a lot of intricacies to them. So does anybody have a big penchant for a story that you don't think you know that you'd really like to hear more about? What's that? Coin toss? All right. Well, we'll take them in order. Let's look at, all right. Let's take a look at Saul and David. Hey, Gary, grab a Bible on your way in. So one of the things we know about Saul and David, Saul was in what position? He was the first king of Israel. So Saul became the first king of Israel. Somewhere along the way, David, as a young boy, probably around 12 years old or so, was anointed by the prophet Samuel. And so David now is anointed to be the next king, but there's a problem with that. When one king dies, who typically takes the throne? Their son, the firstborn son, typically would take the throne. Saul happens to have a firstborn son, Jonathan, who is alive and well and doing quite fine, thank you. And so Saul tends to hear about David, but Saul's first knowledge, first encounter with David is in what activity, what story, Bible story do we know so well is Saul's first encounter with David? David and Goliath. That's right. Yep. A fantastic children's story that probably everybody knows. We studied it last year, I think, really in depth, and thought, oh, there's a lot more than a kid's story to David and Goliath. That's that would go. But that's as Saul the king, his first encounter with this young boy, David. And then it turns out David's a musician. So Saul was kind of plagued by anxiety, you might say. And so David would come in and play the harp. A lot of the Psalms that we have in the Bible are attributed to David because we know that David played the harp, probably sang, and then also was very poetic. And so that was Saul's first encounters with David, as David killing Goliath, and then David the musician, who would come in and help Saul sleep by being able to play the lyre and sing. Now, as it turns out, as David gets older, and because David killed Goliath, that now David ends up being a person who finds that Saul sees in him some leadership qualities, especially military leadership qualities. So Saul sets David up to start commanding some of the fighting forces that go out. And whenever Saul sends David out, things typically go very well for David. He tends to be a good leader. He has a good military mind, and he tends to conquer whatever it is that Saul sends him out to. And Saul, so far, is really pleased with David until, and this is where you finally get to open your Bible. Sorry it took so long. To 1 Samuel. So we're going into the books of the New Testament. We'll get through the first 5, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then we'll go Joshua, Judges, Ruth. And then we're getting into the books of Samuel and the Kings. So if somebody has in the red book, if you find a page number closer, at 1 Samuel, we're going to look at chapter 18. 291? So it's a 291 if you have one of the red Bibles that looks like everybody else's. And if you have one that doesn't, close, or probably pretty close to there. Although mine is page 477. I don't know what was happening in here. Yeah, large print, maybe so. So 1 Samuel, we're going to look at chapter 18. And we're going to start at verse 5, even though it's the middle of a paragraph. So 1 Samuel. Now, I should point out, because so many books of the Bible get named different ways, of course. And so, especially the books of the New Testament are usually books that are written to somewhere. So the books of Corinthians were written to the churches in Corinth. The Ephesians were written to the church in Ephesus. And then you have things like Timothy, which was a letter written to Timothy, or Titus was a letter written to Titus. Samuel, or else the person wrote it. It's like 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. John wrote those letters. Samuel doesn't work at all like that. Samuel was a prophet, probably the last judge, we might say, and the first prophet in the Old Testament. So Samuel, as a prophet, has these history books and sort of transcribed to his name as a part of that. Nobody thinks that Samuel wrote these books. Thanks, Clara. So nobody thinks that Samuel wrote these books, and these were not letters to Samuel. They're sometimes just called the books of Samuel. So these were books written while Samuel was doing his prophet thing as a part of his life. And so that's what we have in the book of Samuel. So we've gone through kind of what happens with Saul and David, and at verse 18, or chapter 18, excuse me, verse 5, I'll read it because we are recording this, and so then the people, if they're listening in later, can hear this. It says, David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul set him over the army, and all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. So even Saul's servants approved that David, would be this one. As they were coming home when David returned from killing the Philistine, the women came out of all the towns of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another, and they made merry, saying, Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And if you are the king, what have you just heard? What's that? I didn't do so good. And, he was hailed as a real great military leader, killing thousands, until David comes along and has killed tens of thousands. And so we hear from this writer, Saul was very angry for this saying. This saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day on. When we hear that word, Saul eyed David, what does that mean? He what? He kept an eye on him, for one, but also his eye toward him was anger, and jealousy. Yeah. So we might say Saul turned a green eye toward David. That might be how we might even say it in today's vernacular. And he kept an eye on David because he didn't want David to become more powerful. And even if Saul realized that David might become more powerful than him, did he not want David to become more powerful than? Jonathan, his son. He did not want the people turning to David. Rather, he wanted them turned to Saul's own son, Jonathan, as a part of that. So the next little title, if you have little titles in your Bible like I do, the next title after that says, Saul tries to kill David. And I think that might be the next thing we're looking at. Yeah, chapter 18. We looked at 5 through 9, and then we're also going to look at 10 through 16. So when we hear that Saul eyed David, it was more than just keeping an eye on him. He was really looking for an opportunity to kill him, we find out immediately after this. We read, the next day, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul. What's interesting, when the evil spirits rushed upon Saul prior, what would he do? Or who would he call for? What's that? He would call for God. And even beyond that, he would call for David to come play the lyre and calm him down and sing for him. So the next day, an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house. Oh, while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had a spear in his hand, and Saul threw the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Don't you think if a spear was thrown at you once, that'd be enough of a clue to leave? Well, it hangs around for the second one. I'm not really sure how all that played out. But anyways, we read on at verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And David marched out and came in leading the army. David had successes in all his undertakings, but the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for it was he who marched out and came in leading them. So now, as it turns out, what's Saul going to do? Continue to send David out, because if you continue to go out to war, what inevitably could happen? You might get killed, right? Right? So that was kind of Saul's approach. Let's keep sending him into battle. And guess who keeps coming home? David. Oh, of all the nerve. And then we're going to jump ahead here now to verse 27. So same in 1 Samuel 18, but we're going to jump to verse 27. So now what happened is Saul says, all right, I got to figure out how I can get rid of David and make it look natural. So because David had killed Goliath, Saul had promised one of his daughters in marriage to whoever would kill Goliath. Well, David was like 12, so I don't think he had any concern for a wife at that point. But now that he's the commander of an army, Saul says, well, you get to marry one of my daughters. And he was betrothed to one, and she ended up marrying somebody else. It doesn't give us a good explanation why necessarily, but now he's been told that he will marry Saul's daughter, Michal. And as a part of that, though, Saul says, but I need you to do, some little tasks, sort of like the tasks of Hercules. You just have to go out, do a couple of simple things. So he tells him he has to go out and slay 100 Philistines and then prove that he's done that and bring them back. So at verse 27, we read that David rose and went along with his men and killed 100 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king. What a prize. That he might become the king's son-in-law. So if you had to go out and kill 100 Philistines and bring a part of their body back to the king, what was Saul counting on along the way? One of them would kill you first, right? And it didn't happen. So Saul gave him his daughter, Michal, as a wife. But when Saul realized again that the Lord was with David and that Saul's daughter, Michal, loved him, Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy from that time forward. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his fame became very great. And all the while as his fame is increasing, what happens to Saul's fame? It decreases. And what happens to Saul's anger toward David? It increases, right? Those are exponentially in contrast to one another. And so that's what we see happening. Now, as it turns out, David ends up having a best friend throughout this process now, as Saul's always trying to kill him, and he somehow seems to evade it. And Saul sends him to war, and he keeps coming back. But he also develops this really good friendship along the way with, of all people, Saul's son, Jonathan. Yeah, so it becomes David's best friend. And so a couple of times, Saul is even planning to kill David. He lets it slip to Jonathan. And what does Jonathan do along the way? warns David, I'm going to tell you, hey, my dad's going to try to kill you tonight. Oh, okay, I guess I won't show up for dinner for that one after all. And this kind of keeps going along. So sometimes Saul even gets mad at his son Jonathan for telling David that he shouldn't come to dinner because Saul had planned on killing him at dinner. Which I don't know if that doesn't make much of an appetizer in my sense, but somehow in the midst of this, it was all supposed to work. But we're going to jump ahead now. What happens is David ends up having to flee. He knows that at a certain point, he's not going to be able to keep showing up around Saul and so forth. So he says, time for me just to leave Jerusalem. And so he pretty much lives life on the lam for years, just running away from Saul, trying to do nothing more than just keep himself alive during this time. And we're going to pick up with a couple of stories that we catch along this time. Actually, just a pointed verse that we'll look at is, jump ahead to chapter 23. And this is after Saul continues to go after David, and he always just misses him. You know, David's at with a group of priests, and he leaves that grouping of priests, and Saul shows up a couple hours later. And Saul, every time Saul hears where David is, he goes after him and always just misses him. David just continues to elude him. And at chapter 23, at the end of verse 14, this is just a little verse, a half a verse that we read. Saul sought him, that is David. Saul sought David every day, but the Lord did not give him into his hand. Now that's very interesting when you think about that. If you think about when we talked about Saul's first conquest, and then you even talk about David going out against the Philistines, was it always that people would say, and it was David's brilliant mind that conquered the Philistines, or it was David's power and might or leadership that allowed him to be successful? No. What do we hear? We heard God gave them, the Philistines, into his hand. That's a very common thing that we hear throughout the Old Testament. And here, it's interesting, what we hear is Saul sought David every day, but the Lord did not give him into his hand. So somehow the Lord's protection is upon David during all of this time. And so this is kind of like these chapters of 1 Samuel at this point. This is what we're hearing. But then a couple of really cool stories that are worth looking at. We're going to jump up to chapter 24. Oh, which wasn't a very big jump. We're actually only at 23, so probably just down the page. So David knows he's gotten very lucky a couple times, at least that's probably in his mind. As much as he knows God is with him, he also realizes he just barely escaped Saul a couple of times. And it feels like every time he turns around, there's Saul. Now, David has gathered some people around him as well. You know, he has some of the people who he had led out to battle. And when he left Jerusalem, he had people followed him because they wanted to probably not just be with him, but even potentially protect him at certain points along the way. And so David's got his small little clan. You wouldn't really call it an army probably at this point. But as Saul's pursuing him, is Saul just bringing a little clan of people with him? No, what is he bringing with him? He's bringing the army. Yeah, the army is coming out against David and David's little clan at this point. It's not going to be an even fight if they end up in battle somewhere by any means. But in chapter 24, this is what we hear. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of Israel and went to look for David and his men in the direction of the rocks of the wild goats. That'd be awesome. I don't know if that exists anymore, but if I ever get there, I want to see the rocks of the wild goats. What's that? It's probably gone, I guess, too, or no one could find it. It's probably not gone. It just doesn't. It's not like there's a signpost that said rocks of the wild goats anymore. he came to the sheepfolds beside the roads where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. I love the earthiness of some of our Bible stories. Saul went in to relieve himself. Now, David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave, which I think is hilarious. The men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you." What an interesting phrase they said. Do to Saul as what seems good to you. And think about what would seem good to David. What do you think? To kill him. You think that would make David feel good. I'm done. I'm done fleeing. And then what would happen to David's best friend, Jonathan? He'd become king, which David would be delighted with, to see all of that happen. Let's see. I was talking, then I forget where I just was. So, in both parts of the cave. Oh, okay. As it seems good to you. And then we pick it up still partway through verse 4. Then David went and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's cloak. Well, just to cut a little piece of cloth off of his cloak. Afterward, David was stricken to the heart because he had cut off a corner of Saul's cloak. So his men said to David, "You know what you should do? Go kill Saul." And instead, he just cuts off a little piece of his garment, and he's so distraught. Why? Because Saul is anointed. Saul is the king, and by being king, Saul is still God's anointed. And so the robes he was wearing were kingly robes, and David tore off a piece of the king's robes. Now, when we think about that, we think about the importance of what it meant to be one of God's anointed ones. It is massive. And as we look at this in different languages, what other word do we use very commonly in English, but that we will attribute to somebody that we'll pay attention to at some point? His name was Jesus. What kind of title do we give to Jesus? The Anointed One. What's the word we use for it? Wait, I don't know if I heard it yet. Messiah. Messiah means anointed one. Actually, some people would say quite literally translated means smeared one, because you would have taken the oil typically in your hand and you would have, kind of smeared it on the person's forehead. We do that in baptism now today. We just try to be really delicate about it, but they would have called the Messiah would have been the smeared one or the anointed one. So when we hear Jesus Messiah, it's Jesus, the anointed one. Interesting that David had such respect for the one who was anointed. And when we think about that, Jesus traces back to whom? David. And David had been anointed as well, but hadn't been acclaimed as king. Yeah, right. So David has also been anointed, but would not want to raise his hand against another of God's anointed ones at this point. That process of anointing becomes so important to David at this point. So verse 5, afterward David was stricken to the heart because I cut off a corner of Saul's cloak. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord." That's how he refers to Saul, as my Lord. The Lord's anointed, to raise my hand against him, for he is the Lord's anointed. So David scolded his men severely and did not permit them to attack Saul. Then Saul got up and left the cave and went on his way. The story's not done yet, though. Afterwards, David also rose up, went out of the cave and called after Saul, "My Lord the King." It's incredible the respect that David continues to show with his language and everything that we get recorded here. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the ground and did obeisance. David said to Saul, Why do you listen to the words of those who say David seeks to do you harm? This very day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you into my hand in the cave. So even David feels like this was the Lord's doing to make Saul that vulnerable in the cave. And some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not raise my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See my father. Again, what language? See my father. See the corner of your cloak in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your cloak and did not kill you, you may know for certain that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you are hunting me to take my life. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you. And as the ancient proverb says, out of the wicked comes forth the wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom do you pursue? A dead dog, a single flea? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you. May he see to it and plead my cause and vindicate me against you. But David's doing everything he can to placate Saul at this point, to have him realize that this is not. As this ends up, when David's finished speaking, Saul said, "Is it your voice, my son David?" Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you've repaid me with good, whereas I have repaid you evil. Today you explained how you've dealt with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put you in my hands. For who has ever found an enemy and sent the enemy safely away? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. Now I know that you shall surely be king, and that the king of Israel shall be established in your hand." Saul's kind of admitting the inevitable. "Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not wipe out my name from my father's house." So David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So you'd think peace between the two, right? They've sort of figured it out. David had a chance to kill Saul. Saul clearly recognizes it, because I'm sure he would have looked down at his robe and said, "It looks like a piece of cloth about this big was torn off of my robe. And what do you think David's holding in his hand? That very piece of cloth." So it's a pretty evident thing of what just happened here. And David sort of declares who he is and what he's about. And Saul then just kind of turns himself over to David, basically, even saying, "Surely you're going to be king," because, as you pointed out, Stephanie, he knows that David's been anointed somehow. The word of what happened in Bethlehem when the prophet Samuel visited Jesse and his sons is when David was anointed, and Saul has become aware of some of that. So he realizes that Israel would clearly get in line behind David when it would be time for David to be king. And Saul just wants to make sure his house isn't cut out of all of that. Because if you were not from the king's house and then you were anointed king, what would be sometimes the first thing that you did? Clean house, wipe out the competition. And the competition would be the prior king's sons. And so oftentimes when a king took a throne and got an army assembled, the first thing they did was take care of the sons of the previous king so that there wouldn't be any tension and who they would follow. And so that would have been Saul's expectation of what David would do in the midst of that. So Saul just is sort of asking for that not to be the common practice, and how David might spare Saul. And if he was willing to spare Saul, then likely he would spare Saul's family as well, if he would come to be king. So all of that happens. Chapter 25 is kind of a different story. David and the wife of Nabal. It doesn't really doesn't make anybody a hero or a villain. So we're going to skip to chapter 26, I think. Yes. So 1 Samuel chapter 26. Now, this will be kind of interesting because we'll start reading here and real. Then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "David's hiding in the hill of Hachilah, which is opposite Jezamon." So Saul rose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, with 3,000 men of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. Why is Saul seeking David? Well, let's find out. Okay. Saul encamped on the hill of Hakilah, which is opposite Jeshimon. I wish they would have just named things differently. Beside the road. But David remained in the wilderness. When he learned that Saul had come out after him in the wilderness, David sent out spies and learned that Saul had indeed arrived. Then David, set out and came to the place where Saul had encamped. And David saw the place where Saul lay with Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army. Saul was lying within the encampment while the army was encamped around him. Why was the army encamped around Saul? To protect him. Yeah. So what's happened in the last chapter to Saul? He still doesn't trust David. Had a change of heart. Hey, David, guess what? I'm not going to pursue you anymore. I am not going to come after you. In fact, let's have a nice, beautiful truce between us and come on over to my fire and we'll make s'mores. And we'll have a wonderful campfire together. And then somehow over time, Saul says, oh, you know who I think I actually want to be king after all? Jonathan. And what has to happen for that to happen? I still have to go after David. Yeah. Now, as it turns out, what was David still doing after this seemingly peaceful ending between him and Saul? It says Saul went back to Jerusalem, and what did David do? Headed out to the wilderness. Yeah, David headed out to the wilderness. Now, he might have then teamed up with the Philistines and done some warring and stuff like that around the way. But he knew that Saul's heart was not going to be firm in the covenant that he made. When have we heard in another story a powerful leader saying, oh, you can do this, and then having a change of heart? It goes way back. Moses was dealing with the Pharaoh in Egypt. Yeah, yeah, you can go out for 3 days and worship. Oh, no, you can't. Yeah, you can go out and have a sacrifice. Oh, no, you can't. And so we heard this over and over. So David's probably thinking, yeah, Saul's a lot like the Pharaoh. It sounds good. I'll make up my mind and then have a change of heart. So David was kind of on guard for that, being realistic about what might happen. So this is what we hear. Let's jump past all those hard names again. So Saul was lying with the encampment and the army was camped around him in verse 6. Then David said to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Joab's brother, Abishai, son of Zeruiah, who will go down with me into the camp to Saul? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. What does that sound like? To go down into the camp, 2 people against Saul's 3,000? Smart move? Not particularly, I wouldn't think, especially when Saul's in the middle of all of the people encamped around him. But I don't think Abishai gets enough press from saying, I will go down with you. So David and Abishai went to the army by night. There Saul lay sleeping with the encampment with his spear stuck in the ground right at his head. And Abner and the army lay around him. Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand today. Where have we heard that before? Only 1,000 times. Now, therefore, let me pin him to the ground with one stroke of the spear. I will not strike him twice. Why is that so important? What doesn't wake up and scream, and wait, it's still God's anointed. If you're going to kill God's anointed, you do it with one stroke. You don't injure, and so forth. And he understood that David was already distraught a couple chapters ago, just from cutting a piece of his cloak off. He's certainly not going to want to see Saul hewn to pieces in front of him. But David said, do not destroy him, for who can raise his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him down, or his day will come to die, or he will go into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. But now take the spear that is at his head and the water jug, and let us go. So David took the spear that was at Saul's head and the water jar, and they went away. No one saw it or knew it, nor did anyone awake, for they were all asleep because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. I have a feeling they fell asleep in a poppy field. That's my guess in the midst of all of this. Then David went out over to the other side and stood on top of a hill far away with a great distance between them. Why a great distance? So they wouldn't kill each other. Right, right. I'm going to make it seem like just in case you're a little bit mad about missing your sword, I want there to be some distance between us. David called to the army to Abner, son of Ner, saying, Abner, will you not answer? Abner replied, who are you that calls to the king? David said to Abner, are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your Lord the king? What a great line to Abner, really stick it to him. You were supposed to be protecting the king. Why weren't you doing that? And I'm sure if Saul looked at Abner, what was Abner probably doing? I was awake the whole time, I swear. I was awake the whole time. I was watching you all night, Why have you not kept watch? For one of the people came in to destroy your Lord the king. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die because you have not kept watch over your Lord, the Lord's anointed. See now, where is the king's spear or the water jar that was at his head? Saul recognized David's voice and said, is this your voice, my son, David? Remember before when David called him my father? David said, it is my voice, my Lord, O king. And he added, why does the Lord pursue his servant? For what have I done? What guilt is on my hands? Now, therefore, let my Lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, this is interesting. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is mortals, may they be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out today from my share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. Because when he's been running, David's been forced to sort of camp wherever he can, sometimes with the Philistines, sometimes with Gad, and others along the way. And he's not happy about that, but he has no choice. And so he's saying if that's God's doing, then he'll accept it. But if it's the doing of mortals, he does not accept it as a part of that. Verse 20, now therefore do not let my blood fall to the ground away from the presence of the Lord. For the king of Israel has come out from the presence of the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea, like one who hurts a partridge in the mountains. Then Saul said, I have done wrong. Come back, my son David, for I will never harm you again, because my life was precious in your sight today. Anybody think David believes him? No, I don't either. I've been a fool, and I've made a great mistake. David replies, here's your spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and get it. Again, who's coming over to get it? One of the young men. Don't send a warrior over here. No, just send a child. I'll give him your spear. The Lord rewards everyone for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, but I would not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. As your life was precious today in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he rescue me from all tribulation. When we think about hearing those words, when we think about Jesus, the Lord's anointed, being handed over, as he was said, I'll be handed over into the hands of sinful men. Think about these parallels that's happening through this concept of anointing here. And then, yeah, right. Yes, you're right. Yeah. When the crowds would come in and press in on him and somehow he walked away and all of that. Yeah, that escaping it tends to come through. Yep. Thanks. Then Saul said to David, blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and will succeed in them. So David went his way and Saul returned to his place. Is Saul done? Nah. So what happens to Saul in the end? He dies. That was, I just kind of, okay. Saul decides to go into battle. And when he goes into this battle, he actually goes into a battle knowing he can't win. He's pretty much done. at that point. He goes into battle and is nearly killed in battle, but he doesn't want to be killed by the Philistines, so he takes his own life before he can be killed by the Philistines. Turns out his son Jonathan also dies in that battle. So now Saul dies, Jonathan dies in this battle that they knew they shouldn't have gone into in the first place. And although it doesn't happen immediately, there's still a little tension in the ranks through everything that happens. What eventually happens to David? He becomes king. Yeah, the Anointed One becomes the king as the story plays out. The parallels that we see through how important it was to be God's anointed one. And even for David himself to understand that. He knew that he was God's anointed one at that point too. But what that means for us as we call Jesus Messiah, as we talk about the escapes, and as we talk about David talking about being handed over and not being handed over to the sin of Saul, and yet Jesus allows himself to be handed over to those who would have destruction on their minds against him, becomes an incredible reality of what that means to be God's anointed in that time and space. And we realize David had one task to do as God's anointed. Jesus had another task to do as God's anointed. But both of their stories find certain parallels. And so when we hear in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Luke, when the angel comes in a dream to visit Joseph and he calls him Joseph, son of David, all of these things of David's life get conjured up in the midst of that. And that parallel that we'll see from shepherding to anointing to being king to his life being spared, all of that seems to find its way into Jesus' life until the culmination of Jesus' life, when he realizes to be anointed for him means to completely hand himself over to the world at that point. And that's why I love this story. The thing about Saul was God's anointed. He didn't start out as a villain, but it's amazing what can happen when you realize that somebody else might be, as he thought that David would try to be usurping the throne before it was his time, as he understood that his son Jonathan might not become king if David became as powerful and if Israel wanted to rally behind David and not behind Jonathan. All of these things just started to plague Saul in such a way. And it's kind of a reminder to us sometimes that that's just not the attitude we want to carry into the world. But carrying into the world, what does it mean to be able to lift somebody else up? What does it mean to realize that sometimes our place is going to be leader and sometimes our place will be follower? And to understand what that means for us as people of the church is also just as important for our life today. So that's our wrap up. We won't get to Stephen. Oh, by the way, that's the one thing I was going to tell you. I'll throw this out. So in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, it's Acts chapter 6, starts in the middle of chapter 6 and goes through just the very, very beginning, first verse of chapter 8, is the story of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Of course, when we read it in English, it looks like Stephen, but there isn't really a long E in the Hebrew Aramaic. So I always say Stephen. And that's actually Karen and I named our second son Stephen because of Stephen in the Bible, and his name's actually pronounced Stephen. So just a little trivia note of how those things come together. Our first son is Daniel because in the church I was at the time, we had just done the play Daniel in the Lion's Den, and I was the lion for the play as a part of that. And so then when our son was born, we named him Daniel because it seemed appropriate at the time. So thanks so much for being here tonight, for walking through these last several weeks of heroes and villains. Next week, no education programming. So all of our students are, and I shouldn't say all, but a good dose of our students are on break. I think the Cherry Creek system and a couple others all are on fall break. So we won't have a meal on Wednesday night. We won't have this class. The only thing that's really happening are choir and handbells, the adult choir and adult handbells. Deborah Circle might still be meeting as well, but just note that. So if you show up next week, Bring a Big Mac with you, eat it quickly, and join choir. Yep, that's a good Savvy. You should be here, Leslie, and just kind of welcome people in, to welcome them in to sing next week. And then we'll be going into 4 weeks as we're in this time of fall. We're going to look at stories through the Bible about sowing and reaping. There's so much in the Bible that where stories of planting and stories of harvest become such apropos stories, whether it's parables or things in the New Testament when the people arrived in the promised land and the festivals that they had and their first harvest and all of that. We're going to spend several weeks looking at wonderful stories of sowing and reaping as a great exercise for us this fall. So appreciate you being here tonight. Thanks, everyone.